Hey Guy, tonight we're going to take a slow, slightly muddy walk through the fields of medieval Europe. So get comfortable, maybe pull up a blanket, dim the lights, and imagine the faint smell of damp hay and wood smoke drifting through your window. Because tonight we're talking about the people who lived, suffered, and somehow survived without Netflix, antibiotics, or anything resembling plumbing, the medieval peasants. Now, peasants don't usually get star billing in history books. You know? Because they weren't conquering empires or commissioning marble statues of themselves. But in reality, they were everywhere. They made up about 90% of the population, which basically means medieval Europe was one enormous human ant farm, mud huts, bread ovens, and all. And yet, despite existing in what we would now call a perpetual crisis simulator, they managed to keep going, through plague, famine, taxes, wars, and the general inconvenience of feudalism. So tonight we're going to slow roll our way through how these people actually lived, what they ate, how they worked, and most impressively, how they didn't give up completely when the Black Death arrived and started, well, unaliving half of Europe. But first, let's set the scene. The peasant starter. Imagine you're born around the year 1250. Congratulations. You're statistically illiterate, malnourished, and will probably never travel more than 10 miles from where you're currently lying in a pile of straw. Your house, if you can call it that, is made of wattle and daub, which is just a fancy way of saying sticks, mud, and cow dung. The roof is thatched, meaning it leaks just enough to ruin your sleep, but not enough to justify repairs. There's no glass in the window, so you've stuffed it with a bundle of rags or a wooden shutter. It's dark. It's smoky. It smells like a mixture of animals, people, and regret. If you're lucky, you've got one room for the entire family, plus a chicken or two and maybe a pig that's technically a roommate. There's a small fire pit in the middle, no chimney, and smoke simply drifts out the hole in the roof, coating everything in a charming layer of soot. And before you ask, yes, you do sleep next to your animals. They keep the hut warm at night. And besides, everyone smells equally bad. So it's fine. Your furniture consists of a rough wooden table, a bench, and maybe a bed stuffed with straw that you share with at least one other person, possibly 3. Bathing is rare because water is cold and superstition is strong. You might get clean twice a year, usually when it rains and you happen to be standing outside. Breakfast, lunch, and eternal disappointment. Your diet? Simple. Bread, pottage, and despair. Pottage was the medieval equivalent of soup, except with fewer vegetables and more mystery ingredients. You'd take whatever was lying around, barley, cabbage, maybe some peas, and boil it into a mush. If you had a few onions or a bone, congratulations. You just upgraded your meal to special occasion. Meat was rare, mostly because you couldn't afford to eat your livestock. That pig snoozing beside you in the hut was more valuable alive, producing piglets and manure, than as tonight's dinner. When you did get meat, it was usually salted, dried, or already questionable. And bread wasn't always the fresh, fluffy kind we imagine. Peasant bread was made with rye or barley, sometimes mixed with weeds or ground up beans. During famines, people got creative. There are records of bread made from acorns, tree bark, or even clay mixed with grain to make it stretch further. Not exactly Michelin-star dining, ale was the drink of choice, even for children, because water could make you violently ill. And while it was weak by modern standards, it was enough to take the edge off after 14 hours in the fields. Feudalism, the world's least fun subscription plan now. The main challenge for the medieval peasant wasn't just the plague or famine, it was the fact that they didn't own anything. Not their land, not their tools, not even their time. You see, most peasants were serfs, which was basically the feudal version of being stuck in an eternal unpaid internship. You were legally tied to the land owned by your local lord, who might live in a castle somewhere nearby and occasionally drop by to remind you that your entire life was technically his, in exchange for protection, which mostly meant he wouldn't personally raid your village. You had to work his fields several days a week. The rest of your time, you could work your own small patch of land, assuming you weren't dead or exhausted. On top of that, you paid rent in crops, livestock, or labor. And if you thought taxes were bad now, Imagine handing over your grain to a guy in shiny armor who claims divine right to your sweat because his great-great-grandfather stabbed someone important in 1066. You also owed dues to the church, of course, because if there's one thing medieval Europe loved, it was reminding you that salvation wasn't free. The church took its tithe, 10% of your income, usually in grain or livestock. So yes, you were paying two different lords, one with a sword and one with a sermon. Work, weather, and why everyone's back hurt life followed the seasons. Spring was for planting, summer for weeding and haymaking, autumn for harvest, and winter for trying not to die. Work started at dawn and ended at dusk, though rest days existed in theory. The church calendar was full of saints' days and holy feasts, which meant occasional breaks. But of course, those days often came with extra chores. Repairing fences, attending mandatory services, or helping prepare food for someone else's feast. Agricultural work was brutal and constant. Plowing, sowing, cutting, threshing. It all had to be done by hand or with the help of an ox. Tools were basic, wooden plows, sickles, and scythes. The average peasant's hands were probably a terrifying sight, and weather could make or break an entire year. Too much rain? Crops rot. Too little? Drought. Then the Lord still expects his share, so guess who's eating bark soup again? Famines came often. In the early 1300s, one of the worst, known as the Great Famine, wiped out millions across Europe. People ate grass, dogs, even their own seed grain meant for next year's planting. Parents abandoned children. Whole villages disappeared. And yet somehow society trudged on. Because what else could they do? Plague, again? Then, as if the 14th century hadn't suffered enough, along came the Black Death, arguably the worst house guest in history. It arrived in 1347 and promptly started turning Europe into a horror show. Within a few years, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population was gone. For peasants, the plague was both apocalypse and opportunity. On one hand, entire villages were wiped out. Fields went untended, livestock wandered loose, and mass graves filled faster than priests could bless them. On the other hand, if you did survive, life suddenly got a little better. Labor became scarce, which meant peasants could actually demand wages and mobility. Lords panicked, trying to reimpose control, but it was too late. The old feudal order had started to crack. Of course, governments didn't like that. In England, the Statute of Laborers was passed in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, which was basically the medieval version of stop getting ideas above your station. Still, the idea of personal worth had begun to sprout, like a weed between the stones of the old system. Medicine, or whatever that was. When it came to health, medieval peasants didn't have much going for them. Doctors existed, sure, but they mostly served the rich and were about as useful as a horoscope. The average peasant relied on herbal remedies. Superstition and whatever local wise woman knew how to make a poultice out of moss and good intentions. Common cures included things like bloodletting, burning herbs, or wearing amulets to ward off evil spirits. For the plague, treatments ranged from bathing in vinegar to rubbing onions on your armpits. Unsurprisingly, survival rates were not great. Still, peasants were surprisingly resilient. They built up immunity to local diseases, used honey as an antiseptic, and developed folk medicine that actually worked sometimes. Modern historians have found that despite their rough lives, many peasants lived into their 50s or 60s if they managed to survive childhood, the secret to not going insane. So how did they mentally survive all this? Faith, mostly. Religion was everywhere, woven into every part of daily life. Bells rang for prayers, festivals marked the seasons, and the church calendar gave structure to an otherwise monotonous grind. Life was short, brutal, and largely beyond your control, so believing in a divine plan was comforting. Death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something hopefully less drafty. There was also community. Villages were tight-knit, partly because you had no choice. People shared labor, tools, gossip, and occasionally diseases. Weddings, feasts, and church festivals offered brief moments of joy amid the mud. Music, storytelling, and simple games kept spirits alive, even in the darkest times. Humans have an uncanny ability to laugh at absurdity, like that one guy in the next village who got kicked by a mule and claimed it was divine punishment. Let's float over to another peasant problem: clothing. Because believe it or not, fashion mattered. Even when your entire wardrobe fit on one hook, peasants wore wool. Lots of it. Scratchy, heavy, and occasionally full of lice, but it kept you warm. Undergarments were made of linen if you could afford it. Most clothes were natural shades of brown or gray because dyes were expensive. Brown or gray because dyes were expensive. Women wore long dresses and aprons. Men wore tunics and hose. Shoes were optional. Wooden clogs were common, but barefoot was the default. Jewelry? Maybe a simple pewter brooch or a bit of ribbon if you were feeling fancy. Your social rank was literally visible. Laws known as sumptuary laws dictated what you could and couldn't wear based on class. So, no, you couldn't just show up at the fair wearing velvet unless you wanted a fine, and possibly a lecture from someone with better shoes. And yet somehow they endured. Through centuries of plague, famine, war, and exploitation, the medieval peasantry kept Europe alive, quite literally. They grew the food, built the roads, and maintained the system that everyone else depended on. Without them, there would have been no kings, no castles, no cathedrals. Just empty land and hungry nobles arguing over whose turn it was to starve first. Hey again, still awake? Good. Let's stay in that half-dreamy space as we drift back to our damp little medieval village. The fire is low, the chickens are asleep, and somewhere out there, the Lord's hounds are howling at absolutely nothing. Tonight, we're not talking about plagues or taxes or famine, at least not directly. No, tonight we're slipping into something far more complicated and confusing. Peasant romance. Because even when your life expectancy barely reached 40, and your main accessory was a callus the size of a walnut, love, or at least marriage, still found a way, the peasant dating scene, it's not great. Now let's get one thing straight. Medieval peasants didn't date. There were no moonlit strolls or secret love letters written in elegant Latin. There was no swipe right moment, unless you count swiping mud off your face after a long day threshing wheat. Marriage was, above all else, a practical contract. It wasn't about passion. It was about survival. Two people teaming up to produce labor, children, and hopefully enough bread to make it through the winter. That said, it wasn't entirely loveless. There are court records, songs, and even church notes suggesting peasants did fall for each other. There were flirty glances at harvest festivals, whispered promises during haymaking, and stolen kisses behind granaries. Very rustic, very itchy. Still, your choice of partner was limited. You usually married within your village, sometimes even within your extended family. Travel was rare and so were options. If you didn't like your neighbor's daughter, tough luck. She was probably your only unmarried option under 40. Parental influence and lordly interference, parents played a major role in marriage arrangements, especially when land was involved. Even the poorest peasant families wanted to ensure their children didn't marry down, which, considering everyone was already down, took some creative negotiation. But the real power lay with the Lord. Remember, peasants were serfs, legally bound to the estate. That meant you couldn't just marry whoever you wanted. You actually needed the Lord's permission to wed. Because if two serfs from different estates married, it created a jurisdictional nightmare over which Lord owned the family's labor. So yes, your romantic future depended on a man who probably thought soap was a French conspiracy. Lords could, and often did, demand a merchant fee, a sort of marriage tax paid by the bride's family to compensate for her leaving the workforce. The church didn't love this practice, but it tolerated it. After all, someone had to fund all those stained glass windows. The wedding day. If you managed to clear all those hurdles, parental approval, lordly consent, and the vague hope that your partner still had most of their teeth, it was time for the big day. Peasant weddings were loud, chaotic, and wonderfully unpolished. Forget white dresses or diamond rings. The bride wore her best tunic, often borrowed, and the groom probably just brushed off his usual clothes and called it an upgrade. Ceremonies took place outside the church doors, literally on the porch, where vows were exchanged in front of witnesses. Only after that would the couple go inside for a blessing. Then came the feast, which was the real reason everyone showed up. There'd be ale, bread, maybe some roasted meat if the village pooled resources. There was dancing, singing, and general merriment, basically a temporary amnesia from everyday hardship. And because medieval humor was about as subtle as a shovel, there were plenty of jokes about fertility. The newlyweds were often escorted to bed by a crowd of cheering guests who made sure the marriage was, well, officially started. Romantic, in a group project kind of way. Life after the vows, after marriage came routine, and a lot of it. The average peasant couple had multiple children, though only a few might survive past infancy. Childhood mortality was high. Disease, famine, and bad luck claimed many, but children were essential labor, so families kept trying. Husbands worked the fields or performed labor services for the Lord. Wives handled domestic work, cooking, cleaning, spinning, brewing, gardening, raising animals, and caring for children. But here's the thing. Women worked just as hard as men, sometimes harder, and in the records that survive, it's clear they were vital to the household economy. A good wife wasn't just a homemaker. She was a co-worker, business partner, and occasional negotiator with the local bailiff. Love and fidelity, sort of. Was there love? Probably, though romantic affection meant something different back then. Most couples grew into companionship rather than falling headlong into it. They shared hardships, supported each other, and, if they were lucky, had a few laughs in between. Infidelity did happen, but it was risky. Adultery was a sin and, in some places, a punishable offense. The church courts were filled with cases of inappropriate relations, though most ended in public penance rather than punishment. Still, the gossip was relentless. Medieval villagers loved a scandal. Someone caught sneaking into a barn after dark could expect their reputation to travel faster than the plague. And for unmarried women, a pregnancy outside wedlock was catastrophic, both socially and economically. But humans are humans, and love, or at least lust, didn't always follow rules. Records show plenty of irregular unions, couples who lived together without formal marriage but were accepted by their community anyway. The church complained, but not too loudly. After all, they still needed the peasants to keep populating the pews. When marriage went wrong, not every match was a happy one. Domestic violence was sadly common and often tolerated. The law gave husbands wide authority over their wives, though extreme cases could lead to community intervention. Separation was rare, and divorce was nearly impossible. The church allowed annulments, but only under special conditions, like if one partner was too closely related, or if the marriage hadn't been consummated, cue awkward public inquiries. Still, people found ways to cope. There are accounts of couples informally splitting and living separately, each managing their own patch of land. Others relied on family or community elders to mediate disputes, and occasionally someone simply vanished. Runaway spouses weren't unheard of, though given the dangers of medieval travel, it wasn't exactly a happy ending. Sex, superstition, and sin now. Let's talk about the thing everyone in the 14th century pretended not to talk about. Sex. The church had opinions. Lots of them. Sex was strictly for procreation, never for pleasure, and preferably done on specific days, in specific positions, and only between married people who were not currently pregnant, menstruating, or celebrating a feast day, which left, maybe 6 days a year. Of course, no one followed these rules perfectly. Peasants weren't stupid. They just didn't document their bedroom adventures. But church sermons and confessional manuals suggest a constant tug-of-war between natural desire and religious guilt. Superstitions also ran wild. Certain herbs were believed to promote fertility or prevent it. Charms and prayers were used to bless marriages or to curse an unfaithful lover. It's easy to laugh now, but remember, when your life was precarious and medicine was non-existent, a bit of ritual and belief gave people a sense of control. The economics of love was lovely, but money, or rather grain, was what made marriages work. Dowries were a key part of the process, even for peasants. A bride might bring a small sum of coins, some livestock or household goods like a spinning wheel or a chest. These weren't luxuries, they were investments in the new household. Marriage was as much an economic merger as an emotional one. And yes, disputes over property caused endless problems. When fathers died, land was divided among sons, or sometimes passed to daughters if there were no male heirs, sparking family feuds that could drag on for generations. The village reeve or local court often stepped in to settle arguments about who owned which strip of field or who got to keep the family cow after a marriage fell apart. If it sounds petty, that's because it was. But when your livelihood depended on a few square meters of barley, every boundary mattered. Festivals, flirting, and the rare moment of fun, for all its restrictions, peasant life wasn't joyless. Festivals were a big deal, the medieval version of community therapy. May Day, harvest celebrations, and saints' festivals were chances to relax, drink, dance, and, of course, flirt. Songs, games, and contests gave young people opportunities to mingle. Some of these games were surprisingly risque. Steal the Goose, for example, involved catching a greased goose while riding a horse. Others were more hands-on, like Snap Apple, which often ended with participants face-to-face under suspicious circumstances. And then there were summer fairs. These were enormous gatherings where merchants, farmers, and travelers mingled. For young people, they were also prime matchmaking territory. So yes, peasants had fun. Crude, muddy, drunken fun, but fun nonetheless. And sometimes, between the dancing and the ale, real affection blossomed. Love in a world that didn't care, at the end of the day, peasant love stories were less about romance and more about endurance. Two people working side by side, trying to survive in a system that offered them very little. They built families, shared losses, celebrated small victories, and occasionally told jokes about their lord's horse being smarter than he was. They knew joy and jealousy, tenderness and tragedy, just like we do. Only their world smelled more strongly of wet straw. The quiet scandals, and yes, there were scandals. Always. Maybe a widow remarrying too soon after her husband's death. Maybe a farmhand accused of fathering a child with someone else's wife. Or a secret relationship between a peasant girl and the local priest, something that happened more often than the church liked to admit. Villages remembered everything. Gossip could last decades. Sometimes entire family reputations were built or ruined by one night of questionable decisions. And yet communities were forgiving in their own way. They couldn't afford to exile everyone who broke a rule. Life was too interconnected, too dependent on cooperation. So grudges faded, scandals were absorbed, and people carried on. Love medieval style. So if you strip away the mud, the superstition, and the smell of boiling turnips, what do you find? Something deeply human. Peasants may not have written love poetry like nobles, or built marble monuments to their partners, but they lived love in the truest sense, through shared work, loyalty, and quiet resilience. When a husband died young, and many did, widows often held the household together, raising children and managing land with skill and toughness. When wives passed away in childbirth, men remarried quickly, not out of coldness, but out of necessity, because survival demanded it. So, by now, our medieval peasant has survived winter by the skin of his chapped, dirt-crusted fingers. He's avoided eating his own boots, managed not to die of rickets, and only lost one cousin to what might have been either the sweating sickness or just Tuesday. But spring is coming, and that means it's time to do what peasants did best, work themselves into the mud for someone else's profit. Because here's the thing, medieval society loved order. God at the top, king right beneath him, nobles, somewhere lounging in between, priests humming along, and at the absolute bottom, clutching their hoes and their aching backs, the peasants. The system even had a divine stamp of approval. Everyone was where God wanted them. So if you were born a peasant, congratulations. Heaven apparently needed you to be extremely tired and slightly malnourished. Let's take a slow walk through their world. Picture the early morning mist still clinging to the fields. The rooster, probably a scrawny and angry one, has already announced that sleep is a luxury of the rich. Our peasant gets up, stretches, and maybe mutters something unholy under his breath because his thatched roof just leaked again. He pulls on the same rough wool tunic he's worn for years, probably itchy, probably never washed, and steps out into the crisp air that smells faintly of mud, smoke, and livestock regret. Breakfast? If he's lucky, a small hunk of bread and maybe a little ale. Yes, ale for breakfast, because water wasn't always safe, and weak ale was basically medieval Gatorade. It had calories, a bit of grain, and just enough alcohol to make you forget you'd be plowing until your spine turned into a question mark. Now, the life of a peasant revolved around the land. Not owning it, mind you, but serving it. The land belonged to the local lord, who often lived in a drafty stone castle just far enough away that you couldn't complain about him. The peasants worked his fields, tended his livestock, repaired his roads, and gave him a chunk of everything they produced, sometimes as much as half. It was a bit like paying rent to someone who also claimed ownership over your soul, but this wasn't all gloom and toil. Peasant life had its rhythms. Seasons dictated everything: planting, harvesting, fasting, feasting. Spring meant turning the soil and sowing seeds. Summer was weeding, scything, and sweating. Autumn was harvest, the one time when everyone worked together, sang a bit, and pretended to be cheerful while calculating how much grain the Lord's tax collector would confiscate. And winter, that was for mending tools, telling stories by the fire, and occasionally dying of the cold. Still, there was comfort in the cycle. It gave structure, predictability, and in a world full of plague and arbitrary divine punishment, that was something. Plus, the church was always there to remind everyone that suffering wasn't just normal. It was spiritually enriching. Lucky them. Religion saturated every part of peasant life. Bells from the village church marked the hours, feast days dictated the calendar, and saints handled the customer service side of prayer. Got a toothache? Saint Apollonia. Lost your cow? Saint Anthony. Crop failure? That's probably your fault, but maybe Saint Isidore can help. Every Sunday, and often more, peasants trudged into the little stone church to kneel in cold silence while a priest, usually the only literate person for miles, mumbled Latin no one understood. But the ritual mattered. It brought the village together, gave them a sense of meaning, and, crucially, a brief rest from the fields. And oh, the feast days, glorious little breaks scattered through the year. Christmas, Easter, Saints' days. Sometimes almost a third of the calendar was devoted to religious holidays. Of course, that didn't mean a tropical vacation. It meant gathering in the square, drinking weak ale, maybe roasting a pig, and enjoying what passed for entertainment. Juggling, dancing, and gossiping about who had stolen whose chicken. Still, compared to the rest of the year, it was paradise. But paradise had fleas. Literally. You see, medieval peasants lived close to their animals, often with their animals. Cows, goats, and chickens were valuable, and warmth was warmth. So, in winter, it wasn't unusual for a family to sleep in the same hut as their livestock. Romantic? Not exactly, but practical. The downside, of course, was that everything crawled. Fleas, lice, rats, the whole mobile ecosystem of the Middle Ages. And with fleas came disease. Which brings us to the less idyllic side of rural life. Plagues weren't a one-time thing. They were recurring guests at the banquet of misery. Minor outbreaks were common: dysentery, typhoid, and the ever-popular tuberculosis. But when the big one came, the Black Death, it rewrote everything. But before we sink into that murky chapter, let's talk about what kept people alive through it all. Because despite the rats, the taxes, and the cold, peasants developed remarkable resilience. They learned to stretch every resource. A single pig might feed a family through winter, and every scrap of it, from snout to tail, had a use. Bread was baked hard enough to last weeks. Soups were stretched with herbs, weeds, and whatever small miracles the garden offered. And yes, sometimes famine meant foraging for roots or bark. Yet, there was laughter. There were weddings, simple, Chaotic affairs full of ale, dancing, and occasionally wrestling. There were births and baptisms, deaths and wakes. People found meaning in community, in storytelling, in faith, and in the small pleasures that came between harvests. It's easy to think of peasants as endlessly miserable. And to be fair, they were frequently miserable, but they also had joy, love, and humor. Life wasn't grand, but it was theirs. So, as the fields turn golden and the harvest moon rises, our peasant wipes his brow, looks over the grain, and maybe allows himself a small smile. He's survived another year. Let's drift now, slowly, quietly, into the dark shadow that changed all of that. Because the winds from the east were carrying something invisible, something small, something that would reshape every field, every church, every family hut across Europe. Hey, you've made it this far, which, statistically speaking, already puts you ahead of most medieval peasants. Because now, we're entering the era when everything, and I mean everything, fell apart. The time when death didn't just come knocking. It kicked the door off its hinges, invited itself in, and asked if you had any bread. Welcome to the mid-14th century. Europe was doing what Europe did best: farming, praying, occasionally crusading, and trying not to drown in its own mud. Populations were booming, trade routes humming, and fields overflowing with barley, wheat, and optimism. And then, from somewhere far away, perhaps the steppes of Central Asia, came a small, furry problem. Not a big one, just rats, and their adorable little travel companions, fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would earn the cheerful nickname, the Black Death. It started, as these things often do, with trade. The Silk Road, that long ribbon of commerce connecting China to Europe, carried spices, silks, and unfortunately, pathogens. By 1347, ships docking in Sicily brought more than exotic goods. They brought corpses. Sailors covered in blackened sores, coughing, bleeding, and dying before the dock workers could even unload the cargo. The local authorities, in a stunning display of medieval wisdom, said, "Let's just send the ships away," which of course helped immensely by spreading it everywhere else. The plague moved fast. It loved cities, those crowded, unwashed labyrinths where people, animals, and refuse mingled freely. And once it arrived, it didn't discriminate. Peasant or noble, priest or beggar, everyone was on the same very short waiting list. Let's picture it. A medieval village, thatched roofs, muddy lanes, the smell of smoke and livestock. At first, someone gets a fever. A day later, their lymph nodes swell to the size of apples. Then come the blackened sores, the buboes, which gave the plague its morbid name. Within days, the victim dies, and then their neighbor, and then the neighbor's goat. And within a week, silence falls across the village, broken only by the distant tolling of the church bell. And eventually, not even that. Because the priest is dead too. It's hard to exaggerate how catastrophic it was. Some regions lost a third of their people, others half. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went unplowed, crops rotted, and trade stopped. The sheer scale of death was beyond comprehension. Modern historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia, roughly half of Europe's population. And remember, medieval folks had no idea why. Germ theory was 500 years away, so everyone improvised explanations. Some said it was divine punishment, God's wrath for sin, obviously. Others blamed bad air, known as miasma. Some decided the Jews had poisoned the wells, which led to predictable violence and massacres. It was a time when fear needed a face, and superstition happily supplied one. But if we float down to the level of the ordinary peasant, what did survival look like? For starters, isolation wasn't easy. You couldn't exactly work from home when your job was plowing fields. So people fled. Villages emptied as families tried to escape into forests or hills. But the plague moved faster than feet. Fleas hitched rides on rats, rats on carts, carts on ships. The entire medieval world was interconnected, unfortunately in the worst possible way. Monasteries were hit especially hard. The devout monks who tended the sick often became victims themselves. Entire abbeys went silent. In towns, the social fabric shredded. Doctors, or what passed for them, wore long, beaked masks stuffed with herbs to purify the air. A kind of early biohazard suit that looked halfway between a crow and a nightmare. And yet, even as death marched on, life adapted. The survivors buried the dead in mass graves, sometimes hundreds at a time. Churches overflowed. Priests mumbled blessings through tears. In some areas, people performed strange, desperate rituals. Self-flagellation, for example, whipping themselves in public to atone for humanity's sins. It didn't stop the plague, but it certainly added ambiance. Then, just as suddenly as it arrived, it began to fade. The bacterium burned through its hosts and retreated. By the early 1350s, the first wave was over. The silence that followed was profound, almost eerie. The survivors stepped out into a world half empty. Villages gone, roads overgrown, fields reclaimed by weeds. The sheer emptiness must have been disorienting. A world where every second person you knew was gone. But here's the twist. Out of all this horror came something unexpected. Opportunity. For the first time in living memory, labor was scarce. There were fewer workers to harvest crops, repair roads, or tend flocks. And suddenly peasants could demand more, higher wages, better conditions, freedom from certain feudal dues. The plague, in its grim way, loosened the iron grip of the manorial system. Of course, the nobles were horrified by this. What do you mean the peasants want to be paid fairly? They tried to pass laws to freeze wages and bind workers to the land again, which led eventually to uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, but we'll get there later. For now, imagine standing at dusk in a silent field. The air is still, the earth damp. The church bells have long stopped. You can almost hear the echoes of what once was. Laughter, footsteps, the hum of daily life, all swallowed by time. And yet the world moves on. Seeds still sprout. The river still flows. Somewhere, a lone plow carves through abandoned soil, and the faint sound of life returns. The plague had reshaped Europe, not just demographically, but psychologically. Death was no longer a rumor. It had been a neighbor. So, the bells have stopped ringing. The graves are full. The air at last smells less of death and more of damp soil and quiet rebirth. It's the late 1350s now, and Europe, still trembling from the Black Death, is a little emptier, a little quieter, but also strangely alive in ways it hasn't been before. If you were a peasant who somehow survived all that, the plague, the famine, the general nonsense of being alive in the 14th century, you suddenly found yourself in a world that had, quite literally, run out of people. Whole villages stood empty. Tools rusted in barns. Sheep wandered unattended through meadows that once echoed with the sound of scythes and gossip. And that's when the tables, slowly, awkwardly, but unmistakably, began to turn. Because here's a fun little detail. The feudal system only works if there are enough peasants to exploit. Without workers, lords can't harvest, can't profit, can't throw their endless banquets or fund their mildly disastrous wars in France. Suddenly the humble peasant, that mud-caked, tax-squeezed, half-starved creature at the bottom of the pyramid, had leverage. And oh, what a deliciously awkward moment that was for the upper class. Picture this. A nobleman sitting in his half-empty manor, wondering why his fields haven't been plowed. He sends a messenger to the nearby village. But there's no one there. Everyone's either dead or has wandered off to the next lord over, who's offering double the pay and fewer beatings. Supply and demand, medieval edition. For the first time, peasants could negotiate. You want your harvest done? Fine, pay me more. Lords were horrified. The social order was wobbling, and nothing terrified medieval elites quite like a wobble. And so naturally, they tried to fix it the only way they knew how, by writing laws. In England, the government issued something called the Statute of Laborers in 1351. It basically said no raises. Everyone must work for the same wages as before the plague, which was both unenforceable and deeply insulting. It also criminalized idleness, meaning if you refused to work for unfair pay, you could be punished. Essentially, congratulations on surviving the apocalypse. Now get back to work. But peasants weren't in the mood. They'd seen too much. The lords, the priests, the so-called moral order, all of it had cracked during the plague. Death had been democratic, and that memory lingered. Life slowly resumed, yes, but something fundamental had shifted. People questioned things. The church had promised protection, but priests died just like everyone else. Nobles had promised order, but their divine right hadn't stopped the rats. Faith didn't vanish, but it trembled. Let's wander into a village rebuilding itself. A few cottages stand where 20 once were. The survivors are younger now, those born just before or after the plague. They don't remember the world that was. They till the fields differently. They trade labor for land rights. They start to move, literally. Many peasants began to leave the manors they were tied to, drifting toward towns where wages were better, and freedom, however limited, was possible. Better, and freedom, however limited, was possible. Towns, by the way, were changing too. Fewer people meant more opportunity. A good weaver or blacksmith could now name his price. Merchants grew wealthier, markets expanded, and slowly, painfully slowly, the rigid medieval hierarchy began to crack, making space for something new, a working class with choices. The nobles, meanwhile, panicked. They saw their rents falling, their workers vanishing, and their old privileges slipping. And if history teaches us anything, it's that when rich people panic, it never ends quietly. In France, these tensions boiled over into the Jacquerie in 1358, one of the earliest peasant uprisings. Exhausted by endless taxes and humiliation, thousands of peasants rose up, armed with farming tools and outrage. They torched manor houses, killed nobles, and declared quite literally that they'd had enough. It didn't end well. The rebellion was brutally crushed, thousands executed, villages burned. But the idea lingered, like a spark that wouldn't quite die. England had its own version a few decades later, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical preacher John Ball, it began as a protest against unfair taxes, specifically the poll tax, which was exactly what it sounds like, a tax on existing. The rebels marched on London shouting slogans that sound almost modern. John Ball reportedly asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Which is medieval for, "We're all human, maybe stop acting like gods." They stormed the city, burned records, and demanded freedom from serfdom. It was chaotic, furious, and for a brief shining moment, hopeful. But of course, the crown wasn't going to let that stand. Young King Richard II, barely 14, met the rebels, made promises, then broke every single one of them. Wat Tyler was killed during negotiations, and the revolt was put down. Still, the message had landed. The world had changed, even if the lords refused to admit it. From that point on, serfdom, the system that tied peasants to land like human livestock, began its long, slow decline. Not instantly, but steadily. By the 15th century, many peasants in Western Europe were free in all but name. They could move, work, and sometimes even own land. And it's strange, isn't it? The very catastrophe that nearly wiped Europe clean also planted the seeds for its rebirth. The plague broke the old order, and from its ruins, something resembling social mobility crept in. Life didn't suddenly become fair or easy, of course. Famine still struck. War still raged. The average lifespan was still somewhere between don't make long-term plans and good luck. But the world was no longer quite so rigid. Imagine, again, that quiet village. The air after harvest smells faintly of grain and smoke. Children chase chickens through the mud. Somewhere, an old man leans on his spade, watching the fields that once belonged to a lord who's long since gone. He's poorer than any noble, yes, but freer than his grandfather ever was. And maybe, just maybe, he senses that history has shifted. Let's linger here a moment, and with the rustling wheat, the creaking carts, the sound of simple lives continuing. Because from this weary soil, this mud and misery, Europe was slowly, very slowly waking up. So here we are, standing in the long shadow after the storm. The plague has come and gone. The fields have been replanted. The graves have settled. And the people who remain, the stubborn, scarred survivors, are building something new, one muddy footprint at a time. By the 1400s, Europe was a changed place, even if it didn't quite know it yet. The great lords still strutted about in fur and velvet, of course, pretending that nothing had changed, that the world still belonged to them and their God-given titles. But underneath all that pomp and perfume, the ground was shifting, quietly, because the common folk, the peasants, the craftsmen, the tanners, the weavers had learned something the plague could never kill: how to adapt, how to trade, to move, to think. And thinking, as it turns out, is contagious. Let's wander back into a small village around 1450. It's early morning, and there's that same gray mist clinging to the fields. But listen closer. The sounds are different now. There's more hammering, a blacksmith's forge, a carpenter's workshop, maybe a weaver's loom creaking in a cottage window. Trade is growing. Markets are livelier. People are traveling to nearby towns to sell their goods instead of handing them all over to a lord. Roads that once led only to manors now lead to marketplaces. And in those marketplaces, ideas begin to trade hands alongside grain and cheese. Money, that slippery new force, is changing everything. The medieval world had been mostly barter: sheep for grain, labor for rent. But with coinage spreading, peasants could now save, spend, and plan. The economy, once frozen under feudal control, began to thaw, and where money flows, freedom follows, and in small, careful steps. The towns especially were buzzing. In cities like Florence, Bruges, and London, merchants were rising, people with no noble blood but a growing amount of power. Guilds formed, associations of skilled workers who set standards, trained apprentices, and defended their trades. For the first time, social status wasn't entirely about birth. It could be earned through work. Imagine how strange that must have seemed to a noble. For centuries, peasants were supposed to stay in their lanes, worship in silence, and die without notice. Now they were organizing, demanding rights, even becoming wealthy. Some of these mere commoners were building stone houses and funding churches. The nerve. But even in the countryside, things were shifting. Lords, desperate for labor, began offering better terms to attract workers: shorter service, more autonomy, sometimes even tenancy agreements that allowed peasants to rent land for money instead of working under obligation. Slowly, the chains of serfdom rusted away, and while the highborn still sneered, the world of the lowborn was becoming more complex and more interesting. Let's step into one of those new towns, say, around the year 1470. It smells faintly of tallow candles, bread, and horses. The streets are narrow, cobbled, and a bit damp. There's chatter. Traders calling out prices, children chasing each other through the alleys, the low hum of business. In a corner tavern, men with rough hands sit at a table, sharing ale and stories. They talk about prices, about weather, about the news from distant lands. Maybe one of them has heard of a strange new machine, a printing press they call it, that can copy words faster than a monk with ink. No one quite understands it yet, but the idea of knowledge spreading faster than sermons? That's new and dangerous. Meanwhile, back in the fields, the rhythm of rural life continues. But it's calmer now. The harvests are steadier, the climate a little kinder, for the moment, and the local priest, perhaps, a little less judgmental. The church still holds immense power, but it too has been changed by the plague. People now pray with a faint skepticism, a quiet doubt tucked behind every amen. And that's the heart of this new age: quiet change. Not revolutions, not loud uprisings, just millions of tiny human adjustments. A peasant renting land instead of serving it. A craftsman teaching his son to read. A widow managing her own small holding. A merchant sending goods to another city and coming back with ideas. These were the ripples that would eventually become waves. But before we get to the Renaissance with all its glorious art and scientific ambition, we need to linger a bit longer in the world of the common folk, the ones who made it all possible. Because while kings and dukes get statues, it's the ordinary people who kept Europe alive long enough to dream again. They endured famine, plague, war, taxation, and the daily grind of survival, and still managed to build families, carve jokes into wood beams, and plant seeds every spring with quiet faith that life would go on. Let's pause there, in a small, sunlit moment, A farmer leaning on his hoe, looking out over his modest but his land. Children laughing somewhere behind him. The sky wide and patient above. He'll never know that historians will later call this the dawn of the modern world. He doesn't need to. For him, the miracle is simply being alive, and a little less hungry than his father was. So let's drift softly into the next turning of the wheel, when the sons of peasants become merchants, and the daughters of farmers learn to read, and the world, for better or worse, starts to think bigger. All right, take a breath. We've trudged through the mud, the plagues, the famines, and the occasional angry noble with a tax quota. But now the air feels a little lighter. There's something stirring in the wind. Not a storm this time, but an idea. It's the late 1400s, edging into the 1500s. The medieval world, with its rigid hierarchies and holy certainties, is creaking like an old wooden door. And standing in that doorway, squinting into a future he doesn't quite understand, is our peasant. Call him Thomas or Pierre, or maybe Jakub. He's an everyman, but also something new. The first faint outline of the modern commoner. Thomas was born after the plague, in a world that's still patching itself together. He's no scholar, but he's clever. He can read a little. Maybe a psalm or two, maybe just enough to sign his name. His father worked the same land for a lord who's now bankrupt. His mother told stories of the great sickness as if it were a fable, a moral tale about the dangers of pride and the fragility of life. He wakes each morning before dawn, as peasants always have, but there's something different about his day. He's not working for free. He's renting his own little plot, and what he grows is his. It's a humble revolution, one that smells faintly of soil and sweat. Let's walk beside him. The fields are neat, green, and smaller than before, parceled up after the old manor's collapse. Sheep graze nearby, quiet and self-absorbed as they've been since time began. In the distance, the church bell tolls, soft and steady. But Thomas's world isn't just his village anymore. Word travels faster now. A peddler passing through speaks of strange new lands across the sea, places with gold, spices, and endless danger. Another traveler brings talk of a man in Germany who's nailing complaints to church doors. Heresy, maybe. Hope, maybe. The world is suddenly full of maybes, and in those maybes, a quiet kind of dreaming begins. You see, for centuries, peasants didn't dream much, or rather, they weren't allowed to. Their lives were cycles: sow, reap, pay, pray, die. The horizon was the same every day. But now, with wages rising, towns growing, and literacy creeping even into the countryside, imagination is starting to wake up. A blacksmith might save enough to send his son to apprentice in the city. A farmer might buy a second plot. A miller might marry into a merchant's family. Tiny social tremors, barely visible, but each one a step away from the feudal world that used to seem eternal. Let's pause on one quiet evening. Thomas sits by the fire, his children half asleep beside him. The room smells of smoke and stew. His wife hums softly while mending a shirt. Outside, the wind nudges the door. He's thinking, not in grand terms, not like a philosopher or a reformer, but in the way a tired man thinks when the world feels uncertain but wide. Maybe his children won't have to bow to a lord. Maybe they'll own their land outright. Maybe they'll learn their letters. Maybe, just maybe, life could be something more than survival. And here's the subtle miracle of it all. That kind of thought, that spark of possibility, was the seed of everything that came next. Because once people start imagining change, history starts moving. Slowly, yes, unevenly, often painfully, but it moves. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this new world. The church was anxious. Literacy meant people might start reading the Bible without permission. Nobles were irritated. Mobility meant peasants might refuse to work. And even the peasants themselves weren't entirely sure. Freedom, after all, comes with uncertainty. And uncertainty can be terrifying when you've lived under routine for centuries. But the shift had already begun. Across Europe, villages were becoming market towns, and towns were becoming cities. Trade routes pulsed with goods and gossip. The old feudal web was unraveling thread by thread. Feudal web was unraveling thread by thread. And here's where our peasant story starts brushing against something bigger: the Renaissance. the age of invention, exploration, and overconfident men in tights declaring themselves geniuses. Now, Thomas won't become an artist or a navigator or a scholar. But without him, and the millions like him, there would be no Renaissance. He's the one who grows the food, makes the wool, builds the ships. His quiet labor keeps the lights burning in Florence and the presses running in Mainz. He'll never know Leonardo's name, or Gutenberg's or Columbus's, but he's part of the foundation beneath their fame, the silent partner of progress. And in a way, that's what makes his story so soothing, because history isn't just kings and conquerors. It's also the countless hands that held the world together while the powerful broke it apart. Let's drift back outside now, into the starlight over the village. The air is cool. The frogs are loud. Somewhere a dog barks. The church bell gives one last, lazy chime. Tomorrow will look much like today, but something invisible has shifted. The way the earth moves after a frost, subtle but unstoppable. The Middle Ages are ending. The Renaissance is beginning, and the peasant, that humble, mocked, overlooked creature, is walking slowly, steadily toward tomorrow. Let's dim the lanterns a little, shall we? The fire's low. The world outside is quiet, and we're easing into that strange twilight between two ages, the part of history where one world is dying, and another hasn't quite been born yet. The Middle Ages didn't end with a bang. They sighed their way out of existence, the way an old house settles before dawn. It took centuries. The 15th bled into the 16th, the feudal world lingered in patches, and peasants like Thomas lived in the overlap. You could still find castles on the hills and serfs in the fields, but down in the valleys, something else was stirring. Change doesn't always arrive with banners or trumpets. Sometimes it comes with the soft creak of a printing press. Imagine it. The year is 1450. In Mainz, Germany, a man named Johannes Gutenberg is fiddling with bits of metal and oil and paper. He's not trying to start a revolution. He just wants to print a few Bibles more efficiently. But that one invention will do something astonishing. It will let words escape. Before, knowledge was trapped, locked in monasteries, written by hand, guarded like treasure. Now, for the first time, ideas could multiply. A book could travel faster than a bishop's command, faster than a king's decree. A plowman's son might someday read what was once reserved for popes. And with each printed page, the medieval spell, that ancient certainty of divine order, began to crack. Let's float gently over Europe as the 15th century exhales. Down below, towns are glowing with lamplight. In Venice, merchants haggle over silk and cinnamon. In Bruges, painters are discovering perspective. In England, peasants are grumbling that wages haven't kept up with the price of beer, a universal complaint, really. And far to the west, ships are slipping out into the Atlantic. They're small, creaky, and wildly overconfident, much like their captains. But they're carrying something more dangerous than swords: ambition. For the medieval peasant, though, the world still feels small. The village is the universe, the seasons the calendar, the church the anchor. The old rhythms haven't vanished. They've just softened. Feasts, fasts, births, deaths, all blending into that long, steady hum of medieval life that never really stopped, even when everything else did. Let's visit one last time. It's spring. The air smells of thawing soil and wet grass. A boy is herding geese near the river. His grandmother sits in the doorway, mending a tunic and humming a hymn older than the parish itself. The church bell tolls, the same way it always has. She doesn't know about printing presses or explorers or new worlds. To her, time is a circle, not a line. Each year repeats itself, a little harder maybe, but familiar. The lords may come and go, the taxes may rise or fall, but the land remains. And yet, even here, even in this quiet, something's different. The miller now keeps accounts. The blacksmith's apprentice can read. The priest grumbles about reformers who won't stay quiet. The cracks are spreading, not with violence, but with curiosity. The medieval world, for all its darkness, had given birth to endurance. Its people had survived famine, plague, invasion, and indifference. They'd buried children and rebuilt fields. They'd prayed, worked, and wept, and still found time to laugh. And in the end, their survival became the seedbed of everything to come. Because every renaissance, every revolution, every dream of progress, all of it grew from their stubborn roots. Let's think of that for a moment. While kings were busy marrying their cousins and bankrupting their kingdoms, peasants were out there, in the mud, in the wind, in the endless fields, keeping the world from collapsing. They didn't write their stories, but they lived them, one backbreaking day at a time. So maybe it's fitting that we end here, not with glory or discovery, but with stillness. The long sleep of the Middle Ages isn't a tragedy. It's a rest after a storm, the kind of rest that lets something new begin to stir beneath the surface. In the distance, the church bell rings one last time. The smoke rises from a dozen hearths. Somewhere, a rooster insists on being heard. And in that calm, in that deep exhale of centuries, Europe dreams its way into the modern world. The peasants will still wake before dawn, still tend their fields, still live and die, mostly unnoticed. But from their hands, rough, cracked, and steady, the world will quietly reshape itself. And as the first light of the Renaissance slips over the horizon, the medieval night finally exhales, not defeated, but complete. So, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through the mud, the misery, and the miracle of survival, and if you're drifting off, that's fine too. The peasants won't mind. They've been keeping the world turning for 1,000 years. They can manage while you sleep. Let's keep our lanterns low, let the room settle into a soft hum, and wander a little further beyond the familiar fields and cottages. We've left behind the worst of the plagues, the worst of the famines, but not the traces. History leaves whispers in corners, in shadows, in ways that reach even the quietest villages. After the medieval night, the world began to hum differently. Roads were still rough, rivers still unpredictable, but merchants now carried letters along with cloth, ideas along with spices. A peasant might notice nothing at first, but change has a way of sliding under doors, small and almost imperceptible. Let's drift over to the villages tucked into the foothills of the Alps. The snow is melting, water gurgles in streams, and children for a moment are free from work. They chase each other around barns, their boots muddy, their laughter soft and short-lived. Behind them, their parents bend over fields that have survived one too many harsh winters. Life is stubborn, habitual, and unremarkable. But that's exactly how survival looks. And yet, the world outside their hills is stirring. Cities are growing. Cathedrals rise like stubborn claims against the sky. In Florence, painters experiment with light and shadow. In Antwerp, merchants count coins in the dim of candlelight. Even kings who once dictated everything are beginning to notice that wealth and influence are no longer just inherited. They can be earned, bought, negotiated. Small shifts, subtle, but they ripple all the way down the ladder. Meanwhile, in the villages, daily life is still anchored in the cycles of survival. Crops must be planted at precise times, animals cared for, tools maintained. Illness still visits unpredictably, and old superstitions linger in whispers, a hanging scarecrow, a well-placed charm, a prayer muttered over sour milk. People live in rhythm with nature and with death, quietly acknowledging both as constants. Yet even here, history has a sense of irony. The very hands that struggle in mud and snow, that stitch clothing, that mend roofs and care for the sick, are shaping the future unknowingly. Peasants' knowledge of soil, weather, and livestock will inform early agricultural improvements. Their stories, once oral, inspire folk songs and legends, keeping memory alive when records fade. Even their suffering, quietly endured, becomes a lesson in resilience. Let's float over to a roadside inn, one of the few warm spots in a cold, damp region. Travelers stop to share food, drink, gossip. Tales of kings, wars, and distant towns are told. The villagers listening might only half understand, but the stories plant seeds. Ideas of justice, of fairness, of life beyond their hills, all sneak in through doors and ears. It's easy to forget that the medieval world wasn't static. Even in its darkest moments, it shimmered with subtle motion. The wind shifts in ways that reshape soil. A single bad harvest changes who eats and who doesn't. A letter can arrive weeks late and alter a merchant's fortunes. Everything small accumulates like pebbles in a stream, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day it looks like an entirely new landscape. And yet, the peasants themselves remain largely invisible to history's grand narrative. No statues, no poems, no gilded tombs. Their triumphs are quiet. A child that survives infancy, a harvest that feeds a family through winter, a well that doesn't dry in summer. Their stories are slow, measured, and profoundly ordinary. It's calming in a strange way to consider that. While kings bickered over thrones and empires collapsed in fire and debt, ordinary people carried on. They tilled, sowed, cooked, cleaned, mourned, and celebrated. The world turned not on crowns, but on hands hardened by labor and minds sharpened by necessity. We drift now to a forest on the edge of one such village. The trees are just beginning to leaf. Birds call softly, and the soil smells faintly of rain and decay. A peasant woman walks quietly with a basket, gathering herbs. She does not know of the Renaissance yet, the printing presses, the explorers, the scholars. But her knowledge of plants, their seasons, their healing powers, will outlast most written records. Nature is her library, and she reads it daily. And perhaps there's a lesson here, as our voices slow and the world outside your window grows quiet. History is not only the grand, glittering moments that fill textbooks. It's the small, repeated acts of care, labor, and endurance. It's the survival, quietly heroic, that keeps the world turning in centuries that never make headlines. Let's let our thoughts linger here, just for a moment. Think of the peasants you've met in these stories. Thomas in his fields, the grandmother mending her tunic, the children splashing in the stream. Their lives were difficult, often short, but somehow unbroken. And in that persistence, they hold a secret power. They outlasted plagues, famines, and lords. They endured, and through their endurance, they passed the torch to the new world, gently, quietly, without fuss. So, as the evening stretches and your eyes grow heavier, remember, history is not just kings and battles. It's mud and sweat and whispered prayers. It's the quiet constancy of human hands shaping the world. Day after day, century after century, and somewhere, under the same moonlight that touches your room, a medieval peasant leans back in the doorway, exhales, and watches the world turn, much like you, settling into sleep. Let's settle fully now, letting your body sink into the softness of the night and drift into the final moments of our medieval journey. We've wandered through fields and villages, past peasants' toil, plagues, famines, and the occasional lord who forgot his own humanity. And now, as the story folds quietly toward its conclusion, we can linger in reflection. By the late Middle Ages, villages had survived, adapted, and grown in small ways. Roads, though still muddy and rutted, connected towns and market centers more reliably. The rhythm of life remained, but patterns shifted ever so slightly. Peasants' voices, once barely acknowledged, began to echo in new ways, through legal petitions, guild memberships, and occasionally rebellions that were more murmurs than rumbles. Even when ignored, their influence subtly reshaped society. Imagine a village at dusk. Smoke rises from chimneys, curling into the orange glow of the setting sun. Children play with sticks that double as swords, or dolls sewn from scraps. Parents return from tending animals or repairing tools, tired but steady. The air smells faintly of bread, wood smoke, and damp earth. It's ordinary, unremarkable, yet it is history in motion, preserved in the quiet persistence of countless human acts. And perhaps this is what makes the story so comforting. There were no towering battles here, no sudden conquests, just ordinary lives repeated day after day. Yet these lives mattered. The knowledge of planting cycles, animal husbandry, herbal remedies, these small, accumulated lessons were passed down, sometimes altered, sometimes forgotten, but always building toward the next generation. Even as kings and nobles staged their dramas, the peasants' steady existence continued beneath it all. Their work ensured food for harvest feasts, timber for hauls, and labor for the smallest projects of the mighty. They were invisible engines of survival, and in their survival, They created a foundation for everything that would come after: the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and eventually, the modern world. Let's glide back to another small scene, one we haven't visited yet. A widow tends her small herb garden outside a timber-framed cottage. Her hands are rough, her face lined, but there is calmness in her routine. She knows which plants cure what, which roots soothe, which leaves spice a humble stew. She is history living quietly, a keeper of knowledge that never needed a scepter to matter. Nearby, a group of young men and women gather in a barn to repair tools, exchange news, or simply rest for a moment from work. Laughter is rare but genuine, a soft sound that lifts from the dusty floorboards. Even amid hardship, life finds space to breathe, to be human. The medieval world was heavy with labor and disease, yes, but it also held countless small joys. And the people who could find them, however fleetingly, were remarkably resilient. And now, as we begin to drift toward the story's end, let's remember the quiet lessons. Survival is not always grand. Sometimes it's as simple as planting a seed, mending a fence, or sharing a meal. Sometimes it's in noticing a bird landing on a fence post, in greeting a neighbor, in keeping children fed and clothed despite everything else. History, in its softest form, is this accumulation of small acts over decades and centuries. So, as your eyelids grow heavier and your breathing slows, imagine the world gently spinning outside those medieval cottages. A soft wind stirs the wheat fields. A cat curls near the hearth. Smoke rises lazily from chimneys into a sky that is just turning from amber to violet. Life continues, quietly, persistently. Not glamorous, not heroic, not even often noticed, but endlessly enduring. And in this endurance, there is a kind of magic. Ordinary people without fame or fortune shape the world just by living it. They tilled, they sowed, they healed, they survived. And through that quiet continuity, the world itself was preserved, passing from one age to the next, ready for new stories to take root. So let us leave them here, in their cottages, among their fields, among the sounds of animals, streams, and soft winds. They are tired, and so are we, ready to rest. The medieval world, with all its hardships and quiet resilience, slowly recedes into the night. And now, you can too. Sleep, gentle and deep, as the centuries whisper softly around you. The peasants rest, the fields rest. Even the lords in their distant, elaborate castles eventually rest. And the story, softly told, drifts with you into the calm night.